Hey, I'm Shaye Wanner, and you are listening to Casual Cattle Conversations. If you are ready to explore different management practices and focus on improving your operation and the beef industry, this is the podcast for you. Welcome to the show. I'm so excited you are listening. Alrighty, folks, today we are visiting with Dr. Keith Belk about a meeting that he was recently a part of. This meeting was about the role of meat in society and had representatives from 6 continents and really provided a place for important conversations to be had. Keith and I discuss why and who was at this meeting, why this meeting was held and who was at it, the importance of improving how scientific studies are shared with society, how society consumes information today, regulations happening in other countries that the United States needs to be aware of, and how cattle producers can do their part to share facts and connect with people outside of agriculture. Remember, if you're interested in joining a community of ranchers that helps you stay accountable for improving your operation and provides monthly resources and conversations to do so, go check out Rancher Minds on my website. With that, let's chat with Keith. Alrighty, folks, let's take a moment to hear from one of our sponsors. At Westway Feed Products, we believe in the best way to raise beef. Our molasses-based liquid feed provides essential protein, energy, and nutrients to keep your cattle healthy and productive. It's an efficient and effective solution that saves you time and labor, working with your existing forages and feed. Learn more about why Westway is the best way to raise beef at www.westwayfeed.com or call 800-800-7517. That's 800-800-7517. And that link is also in the show notes. Well, Keith, thank you for joining me for this conversation today. I'm excited to have you on the show and visit a little bit about what you've been doing and a big event that you were recently a part of. Before we dive into that conversation, can you give the listeners a little bit of a background on how you are connected to the beef industry today?
Yeah, sounds good. So my name's Keith Belk. I'm a scientist, and I hold a chair position at Colorado State University. As a part of being assigned to the chair position, I'm the director for the Center for Meat Safety and Quality. And so because of our location, I would say that a predominant amount of the work that we do on behalf of the industry is for the beef industry. And so that entails working on things in food safety, in eating quality, in trade, especially export trade, and in issues that the industry finds itself facing that are really top of mind but new and different to what we've experienced in the past. So basically my relationship to the industry is in a service role. We're a land-grant university in Colorado, and so my role is to provide a service to our constituent base, which is essentially producers and farmers out in the state.
Did you grow up with an ag background?
I did. We grew up south, actually grew up in Colorado. My family owned a small place. It wasn't our primary source of income when I was small, but we had cattle and sheep, and been tied to the business ever since. So I never really left it very far. So.
Awesome. Well, you were just a part of hosting a large event. So would you talk a little bit about what that event was and kind of why you helped host it?
Yeah, sounds good. So about 15 months ago, we were asked to host, this is probably going to show up backwards on the camera, but we were asked to host a meeting that was entitled the 2024 International Summit on the Societal Role of Meat and Livestock. And the purpose for the meeting was, it was a follow-up meeting to one that occurred exactly 2 years ago in Dublin, Ireland. And the idea was firstly to share sort of the state-of-the-art scientific information that's available that has an impact on how, the roles that meat and livestock play in society, and then talk about what comes next. And in Dublin, Ireland, when they met 2 years ago, the output from that meeting, in addition to updating the current status of the science, was what was called the Dublin Declaration. And anybody can Google it. It's on the web internet. And the Dublin Declaration was really a very short declaration of what scientists want to happen in the future. And then since that time, it's been signed by over 1,200 scientists from around the world. So it's gained a significant amount of traction. And I think that it is important because it changes the social dynamics of what is important to producers. As you're probably aware, producers have come under attack from all kinds of different directions about where does livestock production fit, where does meat production fit. And so this changes the dialogue because it is truly the best science available anywhere in the world on a handful of topics that can be used then to better inform whoever needs to be informed, including the general public. So our meeting was essentially that we covered 4 topics. We covered the role of meat in the diet, the human diet, and so health and diet issues tied to meat consumption. We had a session where we talked about ecology and biodiversity and the role that livestock production plays in that space. We had a third session that dealt with really sort of philosophical issues tied to where meat and livestock fit in society. And then we had a fourth session, which was kind of a summary session, but it was more about bringing experts in that could share how do we do a better job of making people aware of what the science actually says. What is the evidence for the role of meat and livestock in society? And so we had some really world-class speakers in all of those areas, and particularly in that communication area at the end of the meeting. And so we had about 178 guests that showed up from 6 different continents. And so I think it will have an impact.
So I'm curious, what was kind of the overarching message about how to share what the science is saying and communicate about that? Because I know when I connected with you in July, I was actually connecting with you at an advocacy event. So I'm curious kind of what the conversation was at this event for you.
Yes, so this wasn't really, it was not about advocating. It was about showing what the true science says.
Right.
Fortunately for the livestock and meat industries, the science actually is, proactively and positive for what the industry can accomplish. Unfortunately, there's people around the world that I think I would even use the word zealots. They're agenda driven. They believe that their value systems are correct and nobody else is correct, and it's their role in life to convince others of how they should live their lives. And we're facing a huge onslaught of that type of pushback on livestock and meat production that needs to be countered with what the facts really are. And so it's really important that we are able to disseminate those facts in a meaningful way so that those that are involved in policy development or even consumers at large can have access to that information and understand what it means. And so that's the conversation we had. And I don't know that we solved any problems about the best way to communicate those things. It's very hard. Scientists are not very good at it. But we had a lot of conversation about it, and I think you'll see some positive things come out of the meeting as people begin to take action regarding how best to inform society about those scientific issues.
So were there policymakers at this meeting as well?
Yes, quite a few from around the world. I would say the majority were from Europe, Australia, and the United States, but we had folks from, as I mentioned, from all of the continents except Antarctica. And they're in policy development roles from one viewpoint or another. In other words, some of them represent the formation of policy because they're they represent organizations that work on behalf of producers to help formulate those policies, or they're actually policymakers themselves. For example, employees of USDA or somebody in another country, their political structure that forms those types of regulatory oversight. And so it was pretty broad swath of people, and also included in the audience were a number of pretty, I would say, very well-known scientists from around the world. I mean, it was sort of the who's who of people working in this space. And but the goal is to help inform consumers and policymakers. And so that's the conversation that we had is, here's this really cool research that you've done that's very difficult to poke any holes in. How do we make the public aware of it? What's the best way to do that? And so that was the challenge that we talked about over and over again.
So with that, because this was not an open meeting for anyone to attend, correct?
We were very open, but we had to limit participation because of we only had so many seats available in the venue that we used. So we did have to hold the number to a upper line, which we were right at. And so we couldn't accept just anybody that wanted to go to it. And so we tended to emphasize those that are in those policy-making types of roles versus, just the general public at large, because of that limited space and size function. We used our own facilities, our CSU facilities, which are located in Denver in this case. And that's just the total quantity of people that they can hold. So that's what we were limited to.
Okay. So now that this event has happened, what is the most important thing you would say ranchers need to understand about meat's role in society today?
Yeah, that's a great question. I won't say that I can answer everything that's tied to that question, but let me give you a few things. First of all, coming out of the meeting, there was a very serious and I would say unanimous consensus that we need to figure out how to promote action. So what do I mean by that? I think that scientists have passively provided information that's available in the literature, in peer-reviewed scientific literature. That's what we do. But the general public doesn't have it. Normally they don't have access to that information, and if they do, which today is frequently the case, when they read the articles, it makes no sense. It's just gibberish. So we need to figure out how to better convert what the peer-reviewed scientific, records of research say, and translate those into a more meaningful, useful way, and so that's what we're all, I think, learning to do. But so one of the byproducts of the meeting is there's a call to action, and we're still working on what the language will say coming out of that. There's people that thought one thing and others that thought another thing, and we're trying to build a document now that reflects what the audience said, and we'll probably have that in the next 2 weeks or so. And that will become a part of a series of refereed articles that were peer-reviewed by scientists around the world in a special edition of the science journal Animal Frontiers. And that Animal Frontiers journal will be published in February. And so all of this then will be included with the scientific papers that were peer-reviewed in that special edition of Animal Frontiers. And so our hopes then is that that will help people to take the information and put it into action. So that was the primary output, was a call for action.
So that summary that's coming out, that is something ranchers can look at and give them some guidance to put into action?
Yeah,
that's who that's kind of for, or is it for the general public, or who is that kind of?
Everybody will have access to it. So it'll be open source, so anybody can access. But the papers themselves are rather complicated. It's deep science stuff. And so probably, if I were guessing, what will happen is we will take that information, not we, people will take that information and try to convert it into, less jargon, more understandable products that the general public can utilize. So I'll give you for example, I could see something happening where maybe the National Cattlemen's Beef Association or the Pork Board or the National Beef Board or some entity takes that information and converts it into something that's more useful to either policymakers in Washington or producers or consumers, and then they'll utilize that in an educational role. I don't know how that's going to look at this point, but one thing was unanimous is that we need action. So,
well, I think, I know it's early on and you definitely don't have all the answers as far as what's going to happen, but I think it's really exciting that conversations are happening about this topic.
Yes, I agree. They're uncomfortable to discuss in an open public format like that. I think that today, in today's divisive world, I think in particular producers and scientists that work in animal production spaces feel excluded, not included. And I think that they feel like they don't have a voice. And I think that scientists in particular, there's a lot of science that's published that is really well done by the scientific method. Peer-reviewed, meets all of the tests of good scientific work. And so the people that we face that aren't in favor of animal agriculture, the way that they address that, they can't say anything about the science. The science is good. So what they end up doing is targeting the scientists. They get into their personal lives. They do. It's been horrible. It's been very difficult. And it makes people not even want to do the work anymore because of the amount of stress that it creates for those working in that space. And so those are things that we have to fix. And the only way we're going to be able to fix them is we have to make people understand what's really happening here. There's a lot of bad things that happen below the radar that people never see. And for example, there was an article published this morning or maybe this last weekend in Scientific Reports that specifically targets the Dublin Declaration that came out of the meeting 2 years ago. And the purpose for that paper is to appear like science, but it's not science. It's an attack on the people that actually did the work. And that's not acceptable. And so we have to figure out how to, have conversations in an uncomfortable environment where we can begin to address these issues. And that's sort of what this meeting allowed us to do.
Do you mind sharing what one of the most uncomfortable topics to discuss was for you?
Well, I could name several things, but one of the things that we're all interested in is making sure that there's no gender bias in those representing what the evidence is in the industry. And so we had a conversation about that. We had a conversation about what constitutes animal well-being. Where should the standards on animal well-being practices be going? What's reasonable, what's not reasonable? Those are all difficult conversations. And, it's very hard to have those conversations unless you have people there present in a face-to-face format that they've been working in that area their entire lives. They know more about it than anybody in the world. And so when you have those conversations with them in the room, I think it helps facilitate a more open dialogue. And not everybody agrees with everybody else on these things. And so, but you can never come to any sort of consensus on what actions, what role we should take unless you have those conversations. And I could think of some other uncomfortable conversations that we had. Diet health. There's a lot of information out there about how processed meats cause cancer. Well, there's two problems with that. Number one, the basis for saying that they cause cancer is not scientifically valid. And number two, when they say they're processed meats, they don't even know what processed meats are. There's a huge variable definition for what constitutes processed meats. There's no standardization of it. And so there's a lot of those conversations that are leading to more, I would say, proactive education or outreach than what we've been able to have in the past. And, we have to have those conversations within the people that do this kind of work first, and then share them with the external population. So,
was there quite a bit of conversation about creating some more clear definitions, whether that was, processed meats, even regenerative? I see regenerative put on a lot of labels, and that is very broad and even being misrepresented on some labels. And I think there are a lot of regenerative principles that are phenomenal. I think it's important. I just think that's just one example of how words can be maybe misused without a full definition. So were there conversations about the importance of defining some of these terms that we're throwing around in the industry?
Yeah, and I wouldn't say that we ended up at a point where we defined them. That wasn't the goal of the meeting. But calling out where there's those kinds of problems is very important. We don't know everything. Even scientists don't know everything. So it also helps to elucidate where we need to investigate other things. And so that's one of the byproducts of having that kind of conversation. But there's going to be more opportunities to figure out how to address those kinds of issues, I think, as a consequence of this meeting.
Are you really getting rewarded for your feeder calf genetics? Producers often buy their bulls with growth and carcass traits in mind, yet come sale day, the only information share is hide color, and if you're lucky, where you purchased your bulls. This lack of detail leaves dollars on the table come sale day, especially if you are investing in high-performance sires. Top Dollar Angus changes that narrative, evaluating and verifying your calves' genetic value. Most importantly, Top Dollar Angus promotes your calves to a network of feeders that value genetic information. And with personal relationships with over 50 feeders and digital promotion to an additional 150 contacts, they're confident Top Dollar Angus can bring more bidders for your calves. Call General Manager Nate Smith at 620-546-4839 or visit www.topdollarangus.com/earn-more to learn how Top Dollar Angus can help your operation. And that link is in the show notes. So one thing that my peers and I talk about are how, as society, and even sometimes myself included, I try to make sure what I'm reading is, backed by science or somewhat proven, but it's easy just to jump to the first thing we see and not always check and make sure we're reading accurate information. Were there conversations about how to improve that? It's almost a skill set, or make the public more aware and encouraged to do research and make sure they're reading factual information, look for biases in information. Was there anything about the education around that?
Yeah, quite a bit. I will say this. There was a lot of things that we would have liked to dive into deeper in our conversations, but we just ran out of time. But I'll give you a couple examples. Alison Van Eeneman, who's a very famous extension specialist scientist in animal genetics and molecular genetics at University of California, Davis. She was on the program, and she talked specifically about what you're describing, about how we have all these huge numbers of technologies out there to genetically select for things that address society's concerns about whether it be the environment or greenhouse gas emissions or whatever the case. And quite frequently, we're not allowed to use them. So, for example, if you wanted to use some gene editing techniques today to specifically address greenhouse gas emission issues, you wouldn't be allowed to do it. The regulatory approval process is so laborious that, in my lifetime, we'll probably never see that technology used. And so she talked about that a lot. And we've made advancements using things that already exist, like breeding values and EPDs and other selection techniques. But think about how much more quickly we could make genetic advancement if we had access to some of the modern tools that are available. And so that requires a need for education, and it doesn't really require education within the industry. I think most of the people in the industry understand what could be available, but it needs to be acceptable to all of society. So that's part of this thing about helping society better understand what we're doing in science. The other aspect of that is that, particularly I would say in the United States, our general public population is not very knowledgeable about what science is. And so we talked about, if you went down the street and asked 10 people randomly to give you a definition for science, they probably can't do it. And so people all across the United States use that term, but they're doing it without actually understanding what it means. And so one of the things that came out is we got to do a better job of helping our general public understand they don't need to be scientists themselves. They don't need to be trained and mentored in the scientific method like a medical doctor would be. But they do need to have enough knowledge that they can tell bad science from good science. And so that's something we talked about in terms of that communication thing as one of the things that we need to figure out how to do is help the public understand enough about science so they can spot the bogus stuff. I showed them an example of a study that was published out of scientists at Yale University. They called it science. It was published in a peer-reviewed journal, but it was actually an attack on individual scientists. There wasn't any there wasn't any science involved in the paper whatsoever. It was a joke. And if our own profession is leading us to that as a method for agenda-based, attacks on things we don't like, man, we're in a heap of trouble then. So, great question.
Well, it's just, it's not something anyone has the answer to, but it's definitely something a lot of people are seeing, definitely something I've been noticing. It's easy to see a TikTok video or something that flashes a few facts and has very good marketing on it and pulls you in, but you have to make sure that you go fact check that yourself and make sure that it was actually reliable. Because you can pull a sentence or 30 seconds from any conversation, and someone could pull 30 seconds from this conversation and it could be and twist it so it's not anything about what we're talking about. It's just what happens when things get cherry picked.
Yeah, we had a presentation by a person that does research on how society is gaining their information and how to communicate science to them. She's from the University of Georgia. Her name's Alexa Lamb, really, really good scientist in that area. And she told us that, in today's world, you really only have about 8 seconds to sell your message. And you're not going to ever explain a lot in 8 seconds. So what you hope for is to get some of the information that you have through to society using access to that 8 seconds. But I think that's a valid point.
So some of the other scientists who were there, what were their thoughts when she presented that 8-second statistic?
They were surprised. Yeah, they were surprised. As I mentioned earlier, I don't want to speak on behalf of all scientists, but most, at least on our end, we're not very good communicators. We expect society to have more understanding of the areas we specialize in than they actually do. So we use jargon that they don't understand. We use acronyms that they don't understand. We use really complicated, research design descriptions that they don't understand. And it's not fair to them. We've got to get better in figuring out how to get away from that stuff and really give them the bottom line out of research. But that said, there is a bit of accountability on the part of society. They also need to have a better understanding of research because of what I said. They need to know enough that they can, for themselves, decide the good science from the agenda-driven science and separate those two things. And I think that's going to become really an important thing in the future.
Absolutely. It's always two-sided. Everyone needs to be putting in effort on either end of the story. So, you talked about what the event was, what ranchers should kind of understand about why you had the event. Is there any other message that you'd really like to share with cattle producers and those listening now that the event is over and hopefully you've had a little time to digest what's happened and everything? I know you've been really busy.
Yeah, I'm still in lactic acidosis mode. That's one of those jargon terms. But it's a great question. So I'll list a couple things, okay? I mean, there's a lot of things I hope for that will come out of this meeting. We'll see if they happen. We're just, the trade magazines are just now starting to pick up and publish some of the stories on it that were there and available. So you'll see more of that over the next few weeks. You'll see more particularly when the special edition of the journal Animal Frontiers is published. That's going to be a very important because all those papers are fully peer-reviewed. And so it's really an important set of publications that will come out. But for producers specifically, I would make the same comments that I made for a group that I interviewed with that I did an interview for in Europe at the close of the meeting on Thursday. I said, the point of the meeting, as the participants decided, is to take action. And so there's no producer that is in a situation where they can't help address this. Firstly, I think producers need to be knowledgeable enough about what kind of research is being conducted and what's good and bad research. And then I think they need to be advocates for the things that are important to them. Don't allow somebody to target their livelihood just because they're using smoke and mirrors and daggers in the back, to kill their production system. It's not right. And so they need to be an advocate for their own cause. And I know it's hard. And I know producers don't like being in the public eye very much. And I perfectly get that. I'm an introvert myself. But if we're going to address these issues that I've discussed, it has to happen. Producers have to actively engage with society at large and help them understand what the reality is. Not the Facebook, not the TikTok or other, social media information, what the reality is. And I think that they'll be the first ones to admit that we don't know everything. There's things that we need to know more about. There's certain things we need to take action on. We can't be completely ignoring things like greenhouse gas emissions. We have to do things in the right way. We used to say for BQA, do beef quality assurance because it's the right thing to do. Well, it's the same with some of these other topics. But also be an advocate for what you do, the importance of the livestock industry and the food chain, what it does from a nutrient perspective for humankind, and don't let people tell you that it's not important, because it is. So that's what I would say.
So you mentioned, so producers need to be a greater part of conversations within society and being active. So when you think about producers who are already doing that, can you share some examples? I mean, are they doing stuff solo? Are they getting involved in different groups that their morals align with, so they can have a bigger impact? I mean, what does that look like when you think of specific examples of how producers are being proactive? Because in Colorado, you guys have faced a lot of scrutiny about animal agriculture in the last 5-10 years, especially.
Just in the last 5 months. Yeah. No, that's a great question. I'll just focus on beef, but this applies to all of the species. And I think the beef advocacy program that was developed as part of the National Cattlemen's Beef Association has been a tremendous resource. I think a lot of the people that can address these issues best are the people that grew up with social media. So they're people that are generally younger than me, but they can be our first line of defense. So doing what you're doing here, I think, is really important, really important. And I know there's others doing similar things out there to help communicate. But then I think that there's some other opportunities that are available. For example, to name one, the Protein Pact, which is an offshoot of the Meat Institute's programming. It is geared specifically to not ignoring what society would like for us to begin to address. You should be worried about greenhouse gas emissions. You should be worried about climate change, etc. And if that's the case, they're going to help begin to address those issues by their membership saying, okay, we're voluntarily going to begin to invest in addressing these issues. They're going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars in the next few years to implement new technologies to address those concerns. And those are important things. And then they established a communication platform so that they can share the good things they're doing and the bad things they're doing with society as a whole. I mean, they're trying to be fully transparent. And so I think that's a good thing as well. And there's more examples like that. The pork industry has some, poultry industry has some, and there's a lot of good examples. But we just need to elevate, and we need to further amplify those messages, because there's just a need to reach a greater proportion of the population.
Would you say that poultry, pork, and beef representatives who were there were all fairly unified in messaging?
Oh, yes, across the globe, not just in North America, across the globe. And lamb. We had the lamb industry represented as well. And so, I mean, there's a lot of discussion about the right way to approach things and the wrong way to approach things, and things that we haven't thought about, sorts of conversations. But yeah, I would say the recognition of the need for this is pretty much unanimous.
What would you say those of us in the United States can learn from those in um, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, some of those other countries who have maybe had um, different experiences with global perception of meat or different government regulations? I mean, what do you think we as Americans can learn from experiences overseas?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll give you a couple of examples of things that are happening that this meeting in Denver is hopefully will help to address, but who knows? In the Netherlands right now, the government has made the decision that they're going to buy land away from farmers, and they're going to liquidate the farming operations on that land. So they're basically taking taxpayer resources, purchasing land, and taking it out of agricultural production. They're trying to implement what they've called in Europe Green Revolution regulatory practices that limit and or specifically reduce animal agriculture. And so our question is, it's kind of cutting off your nose to spite yourself. Why would you limit your access to nutrition voluntarily? But that's what they're doing. And as a consequence, those farmers are going out of business, or they're leaving and they're going to other locations in the world to produce products. And what that does is it leaves those countries deprived from a nourishment perspective. It puts their populations in a situation where the government is telling them what they can eat and what they can't eat. That's not right. It's putting them in a position where they're making these decisions really without having considered the true science, what the science says about, what's the consequences of doing this. And, you need to weigh those things in a more objective and appropriate fashion. And that's really all we're asking for coming out of this meeting. We're not trying to change anybody's beliefs or moral values or anything else. We just want people to have a legitimate conversation about, does this decision make sense? Does it make sense for you to become unable to supply your populations with nutrition? I don't know. We see the same thing happening in parts of Australia. And it hasn't happened so much in Asia yet, but it's a possibility. And it's certainly those kinds of political situations are things to come in the United States. We've always said that from a regulatory and a public opinion perspective, the United States is usually about 10 years behind what's happening in Europe. And so if it's happening in Europe now, you can expect to be fighting the battle for those things, 10 years from now in the United States. So those things are all important. Good question. I can give you more examples, but that tells you what we're looking at.
How about one more example of some of the regulations that are happening in other countries?
Yeah, so you're probably familiar with the dietary guidelines. In the United States, we have dietary guidelines. They're republished, redone every 5 years. And the way that the dietary guidelines are developed is they put together a group of scientific advisors that establish what they think should be the next series of guidelines that are provided to all of the citizens of the United States. And this similar process, it varies quite a bit, but a similar type of process occurs in almost every developed country. And sometimes in undeveloped countries where people are already experiencing high levels of poverty or malnutrition. And what's the problem with that scenario is that the people that are making the advice, the recommendations on the advisory committees, they have agendas. They're not providing their advice based on objectivity and impartiality. They're not separating their own value systems from the advice that they give. And so you end up with an agenda-driven policy. And that's not right. And so that's something we're facing right now. We're in the middle of it in the United States, and you'll see it in other countries. We actually rolled out what we called a friend and researcher at the University of Brussels in Belgium has developed what he calls the nourishment table. And what we're hoping is that policymakers in the world will begin to consider the nourishment table as in making dietary recommendations. We fully understand that your diet composition affects your health and well-being, but you can't just eliminate meat from it because you don't like the livestock business. Again, they're cutting off their nose to spite their face. And so there needs to be some balance in that process. And so that's another example of where there's really some bad things happening that are not founded in logic and reason. And so we hope that this information that a scientist's job is not to create values for society. There should be no scientist that's telling you how to live your life. It's wrong. That's an agenda-driven scientist. What a scientist should do is objectively collect data and evaluate that data and formulate conclusions based on tests of hypotheses. And then when that information's published, allow society to use it to develop their own values. But a scientist should never tell you what your values should be, and that's what is happening in this case. And so we have to fix that. That has to stop.
I really appreciate you going into detail about what's happening across the world, as well as what's happening here in the United States and what we need to be aware of, in that there's a lot of agenda-driven actions happening all around us. And I guess as we wrap up the conversation today, what final message would you like to share with the listeners?
Well, I'll give you the same message I've been talking about several times. Please be an advocate and take action based on the true scientific evidence. Don't let the scientific evidence be undermined because of people that instead decide to attack the scientists. Number one, they're not qualified to do that. And number two, quite frequently, if they happen to already be a scientist and they're doing it inside the scientific profession, it's not appropriate. And so we have to get by that, and we need people to take action and be advocates for whatever you think your production system should be. So that's I'm not going to tell anybody what their values should be, and no other scientist should either. So.
All right. Well, I really appreciate the genuine conversation today about the event, your perspectives, and what you see. I think it's going to be very interesting and valuable for those listening, and a great reminder for all of us to be aware of what we're consuming and double check our sources no matter what it is. And keep an open mind and visit with people on the other side of the table as well. For those of you out listening, remember I've always got resources in the show notes. And with that, happy ranching, folks.